Order. Welcome to today's session of the Economic Security Subcommittee. We are pursuing our inquiry today into the economic security strategy of the United Kingdom. I'm absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us for this first panel, which is zeroing in on the question of critical minerals and whether the UK has got the right strategy in place to safeguard the critical minerals that our economy needs. And Mike King, perhaps I could just sort of start with you. This is a baseline inquiry, and so we're just sort of building up the evidence base now about the issues that are at stake and the things that we need to worry about here in Parliament. Just tell us, from your point of view, how would you kind of define a critical mineral?
I think a critical mineral is a very, very good question. A critical mineral, I think, is defined by two factors, really. How important it is to the development of an economy and the technology, and how rare or scarce it is as a resource. And those things with high criticality sit on the high end of both of those axes. And the work that was done recently, or fairly recently, by the British Geological Survey on criticality, which informed the current critical mineral strategy, has got quite a comprehensive analysis of that, which has defined 10 or 15 minerals that are critical to the future of the UK economy, many of which cannot be sourced in the UK, but some of which, such as lithium, that can.
And how much would we expect that list of critical minerals to move around over the course of the next, 10 to 20 years?
I think that there are some minerals on there that some metals, and I can talk to lithium specifically, for instance, that it's unlikely that will move off the critical minerals list, and in fact, if anything, the level of demand will outstrip the supply based on all current projections by around 2030. Now there are other minerals where the level of mining activity will probably increase the level of supply. And some of the more niche minerals, which are critical because of the scale of production rather than the increasing scale of demand, may very well move off.
Because they become more abundant.
Because they become more abundant, and there's always a balance between how abundant they are and how commercially viable it is to extract them. But so there is some movement around the margins. But the metals such as copper, lithium, tungsten, tin are all fundamental to they're all either storage or conduction of electricity. And the world is moving towards an energy system which is much more dominated by the generation and distribution of electricity as a replacement for fossil fuels than it ever has been.
So if rarity is one of the two factors in defining a critical mineral, how rare does a mineral need to be in order to become a critical mineral?
I think the rarity is a function of the volume of supply versus the demand. Lithium is as a mineral in the earth is extremely abundant, but the level of production versus the level of forward projected demand is nothing like enough to satisfy future demand. So
does that mean that we can basically judge questions about rarity by just looking at the futures prices?
I don't think you need to look at the futures prices, but I think you can look at long-term projections of demand for the use, which is not always necessarily reflected in even 1, 2, 3 or 4 year forward strip prices for the commodities. I mean, if and again, I'm sorry, I refer to lithium because that's the thing but it's a good example. At the moment, the lithium price is very subdued, around 10 or 11,000 dollars per ton of lithium carbonate equivalent. That was actually driven down by a big increase in the amount of mining activity when the price went up to 80,000.
Yep.
So it's rebalanced. As we go forward to 2030, all of the predictions, which show then an excess of demand over supply, show that going up into the $30,000 and $40,000 a ton, and going forward.
But at this stage, we couldn't read a market signal from future prices.
I don't think you can read because again, if you looked 2 or 3 years ago at the potential projections of future demand, for instance, for electric vehicles just in the UK, that is a proxy for the level of lithium demand. That demand for electric vehicles has dropped, and therefore the demand for lithium has dropped within the battery manufacturing sector in the services UK vehicle manufacturing.
So in thinking and planning for a strategy, government actually has to put together its own forecasting methods if it can't merely rely on markets to send price signals that might help us understand what's going on.
I think the market is more complex than that. The supply chains that ultimately land up in products in the UK market, or any market for that matter, are as dominated by fairly unpredictable levels of political risk as they are by price risk. Now, the two things are conflated, but at the moment, for instance, the lithium market is totally dominated by China. And China has started to weaponize some of the other rare earths and rare minerals that it either produces or processes. It started to reduce the access to its direct lithium extraction technology to other jurisdictions, and all of that affects the ability of supply chains to remove that political risk.
You've got some perhaps unpredictable policy and political risk, which may affect the calculations and which are perhaps hard for markets to read.
And we would say, and it won't surprise you that we would say this, we would say that the way that the UK government and government policy and government strategy and government investment, for that matter, can help mitigate that political risk is to both promote and indeed incentivize domestic production, and actually look at all elements of the value chain, from the raw materials through the midstream, which is totally absent really in the UK at the moment, right through to battery cell manufacturing, which is starting to emerge.
Yeah, perfect. Lindberg, what's your view on how we best think about what's a critical mineral?
I think what is really, really clear is that when you look across the UK and other key jurisdictions, we will not find a universally accepted definition of what a critical mineral is. And I think that is something that's really important to note. What we do note is that the classification really is a function of both needs and priorities, both of policymakers and of industry, because as noted by Mike, what we do see is, in some cases, we have markets that are working to some degree. I think we can debate how well they do work for some of the bigger critical minerals that will continue to be on the list, lithium being one, nickel being one. But a lot of what we call critical minerals are niche minerals that are so small that there isn't really a market that we can talk about in any effect. Many of the rare earth elements are that, where you have, in some cases, a handful of mines producing often these minerals as a byproduct of if you like, the main commodity that's being extracted. And up to date, there hasn't been any commercial incentive or indeed viability in extracting those niche elements. But frankly, to date, we haven't really had to think about that. But obviously, as we have entered a new landscape, primarily geopolitically, and as Mike says, we are starting to see the weaponization of minerals. It shifts the conversation away from where we started, because critical minerals was fundamentally around supplying the transition to clean energy economy. That's where we started, but then that's changed.
So I remember looking at this subject on the Foreign Affairs Committee about 2 to 3 years ago, and it was clear then that risk levels were going up. It feels like, in your judgment, that risk levels are now much more elevated than they were maybe 2 to 3 years ago. Is that fair?
Absolutely. We've definitely seen risk levels increase, but I also think we need to recognise that even if 2-3 years ago policymakers around the world started to wake up to the fact that there are considerable vulnerabilities that have existed for decades. This is not a new problem. We've just woken up to it. But to rectify this at the scale required for this to make a material change, we need very, very holistic policy making and a significant amount of finance behind it, because it will take time, if you like, to rectify the imbalance that has sat there for a long time. And only today the IEA released their report, and we see a movement in the opposite direction. We see further concentration of most supply chains into the top one, or in some cases the top two producers around the world. So the rhetoric and the reality on the ground are completely divorced.
Well, Atherley, thank you for battling through the House of Commons perimeter. How do you think about the minerals which are critical, and how do you think Parliament should define them?
I could take a much more holistic view, and I apologise for being a little bit late. If you take the 19th century, the world was powered by steam and from coal. 20th century, it was oil. It was into plastics and internal combustion engine, and we led the world industrial revolution with coal, and we were a leader in internal combustion engines during the oil-fueled century. We're now into the 21st century, which is the electrochemical century. And China's dominating. China's making very, very clear that it wants to dominate this new generation of the way the world works. And just one simple example is electromotive power. This is what replaces internal combustion engines. It's what an electric vehicle is, what an offshore wind turbine is. That is the biggest energy transition in history. And China's set out to dominate it. And it's dominating it in three ways. One is, as you heard from John, almost unlimited funding, state-backed funding, private funding. Number two is they've recognised that the key to it is the midstream processing. They don't have all the mines around the world, but if you can create overcapacity in the midstream, you can then bring in the raw materials from Australia and Africa and South America and capture the midstream. Once you've captured the midstream, you then own the downstream. And you only have to do one more thing, is sort of counterintuitively, the Chinese have unleashed this sort of Darwinian competition amongst electric vehicle makers. 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there were 400 startups in China creating electric vehicles. Now there's virtually one, and that's the BYD, backed by Warren Buffett. And just by the by, we have another startup revolution happening in China, and that's humanoid robots. We are the last generation who will grow up without a humanoid robot in our household, and they are examples of an electrochemical future for us. China dominates that also. And the final thing I would say is, as John mentioned and Mike has mentioned, the rest of the world woke up 2-3 years ago, and we're now seeing quite significant policy changes towards critical minerals. And again, John was saying it's quite hard to define what critical minerals are. My answer to you is it's the critical minerals which are the enablers of this electrochemical revolution. So whatever they currently are, they're the ones that are going into the batteries, going into the things we need to enable this revolution. And to be frank, it could change. And a given example would be battery chemistry has changed quite dramatically over the last 5 years. It changed originally from a ratio of 8:1:1, nickel, manganese, cobalt. Then that quickly degraded to sort of 5:2:3. And then we've now got these very, very low-powered batteries, which have lithium iron phosphate. And now we've got a manganese revolution, which is a lithium manganese phosphate. So we're now, within 5 years, gone from cobalt-rich, energy-dense batteries to manganese-rich. So I would say to you, the answer to is what are critical minerals? They are the minerals, critical minerals, which are the enablers of the current technology in the electrochemical revolution.
Thank you for setting the stage for us so clearly. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you. And just sort of to pick up on that point, when you came to the committee, Paul, in 2022, you said that the funding specifically had paled in comparison to other companies, not other companies, other rivals rather. So does this still remain your view? And if it is, why?
So just on that particular question is, when I spoke last time, the Biden administration had released the Inflation Reduction Act, and I gave numerous examples from Australia and elsewhere where funding was going into developing their supply chains. What's changed now is we've seen Trump come out this week and talk about a supply chain resilience initiative. And I think what it is, the difference is recognizing, rather than going to trying to back winners, find the right wine, the right mine, the right critical mineral, is to create an environment where people are enabled to realign supply chains. And to that end, the UK, I think, is very well placed, despite the fact that in comparison to the amount of money available with other countries, as I previously indicated, it's relatively low and more challenging to obtain. I would say to you that we are incredibly well placed. I was just at the Choose France event at the Élysée Palace earlier this week with a very nice dinner with President Macron. And the French indicated that I met with Minister Trevor, who was talking about investing 300 billion euros into a HVDC electrical distribution system, and which is great for France. We already have that. We have chemical clusters in places like Teesside, with the world's biggest offshore wind farm, Dogger Bank, 3.6 gigawatts, with the HVDC cable already connected. So I would say that whilst we don't have as many funds available in comparison to these other competing friendly nations, we can't compete with China, but we do have this amazing chemical engineering, chemical industry legacy. And I say, my argument is our greatest gift is chemical parks and bad weather, meaning Teesside connected to Dogger Bank, Salt End, Humber connected to Dogger Bank, same on the in the RSC. So this infrastructure that we've invested in, this several hundred years of a chemical industry, is, I would say, that is worth more than new funding. We can piggyback off that. Now, just one further example, if I can just go down that rabbit hole. If you go to Teesside, there are gigawatt-scale investments going in. Gigawatt-scale data center, gigawatt-scale BESS, battery energy storage, gigawatt-scale net zero deployment of capture of carbon embed into the Devon Formation, and 1.2 kilometre long factories building the stanchions for offshore wind turbines. We're already at gigawatt scale. I would say and what that attracts, and the company I'm representing here today is, I founded a company called Tees Valley Lithium, and we're working with a $6 billion US decarbonisation private equity fund who love the UK because it's got this established infrastructure on all of those sovereign benefits being able to invest in this country. So very, very long answer to say we don't have much money available in this country, but we have fantastic legacy infrastructure that we can build on.
That's great. So that's one of our strengths. I think you've given us some really good examples. So are there any other things that the government could be doing there? And I know that you've spoken that money might be a bit of a challenge. So what other things could the government be doing then to help with the competitiveness?
If there was only one thing, if I left the committee with only one thought, it's energy prices.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Gregor Poynton.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Atherley, you talked about China being, sort of trying to be the market leader in this space. What other countries does the UK most rely upon for our critical minerals? Taking all the evidence that we have already, that it's perhaps difficult to define, but who are the countries that we're most reliant on as we currently stand?
So as lithium took off 5 to 10 years ago, Western Australia went from producing virtually no lithium, small amount, to now produces 51% of the world's lithium through hard rock spodumene mines. China's invested $750 billion US dollars across Africa into mines, railways and ports to access critical minerals into China. So my answer to it is there's lots of mines, lots of critical minerals available around the world. As Mike was indicating, it's where the midstream processing is where we need to worry about it.
Yeah. Do you agree with that? Want to add any countries to the list?
Well, I think the raw materials are coming from Chile, Argentina, South America, some parts of Africa are starting to develop. Australia, as Paul said, is the big, but it really does come down to, I said, lithium is incredibly abundant. It's probably one of the most abundant elements in the earth. It comes down to that market control at the moment. That midstream is concentrated in one place, and one of the reasons that the midstream doesn't have a presence in the UK, coming back to what Paul said, I'm sure we'd all echo this, is energy price. Yeah. the base energy price. It's our development, which is an industrial scale lithium development, will develop 10,000 tonnes per annum. The biggest element of the operating cost by far is the energy price.
The implication of what you're saying, though, is that we can't actually safeguard the nation's supply chains effectively until we bring energy costs down.
I think if you want to being competitive, the people that are investing in the large-scale midstream developments look at it from an internationally competitive perspective, and they will go to where the lowest operating costs and capital costs, for that matter, but particularly operating costs for something that is an energy-intensive industry. Now, is there support for any energy-intensive industries in the UK? Yes, there is. But when you bring all of that support together, does it give you a bottom line power price that competes with Norway, Canada, US? The answer is no. So the investors in that capacity will go to where that power price is the lowest, and that by definition, or is subsidized very heavily like it is in China, and that by definition preserves that political risk within our supply chain.
So the only country I'd probably add to that list would probably be Indonesia, where we do see a fairly substantial concentration of the nickel industry, and this is something that's happened quite rapidly. But with most things, critical minerals, the ways still go through China, because if you look at a lot of the investment that has flown into Indonesia, that has been quite aggressive in its use of various policy levers, including export bans, for instance, you see that they have become a major player in nickel, but again, backed by Chinese finance and often by Chinese companies that have gone in and operate in country. But other than that, I would echo that all roads more or less will go through China.
Yeah, okay. In terms of, I mean, you all spoke clearly and forcefully around energy prices. What else should the UK be doing in terms of, is there anything else we should do to try and ensure that we have the supply chains and we're not as reliant on the countries we've just outlined?
In terms of, if I can just address domestic lithium production, it's a good example, I suppose. We always say there are 3 Ps. We've touched on power. There's people, skills, availability of skills, to drive the scale of industrial development that we all believe, I think, could be developed here. And the third thing is planning, and that planning process. And, we've been designated our project's been designated as a nationally significant infrastructure project, which does expedite planning. And there are amendments, I think, at the moment going through the House in terms of further reforms that would allow that to be further expedited. But again, when investors are looking at this, and it will require a huge amount of investment, they're looking at the pace at which they will get their return and how competitive the operating costs are. But, are there models to make this more? Well, there are clearly models, because you can look at just what's happened with the expansion of the battery plant up in Sunderland, backed by National Wealth Fund. We're very lucky to have with the first equity investment that they had, with underwrite from National Wealth Fund and UK Export Finance, and additional funding from the Automotive Transformation Fund. That's facilitated that investment. Yeah. That's effectively a subsidy which offsets some of the uncompetitiveness of the other elements of it.
I absolutely agree with the 3 Ps. I think looking at it from a slightly more long-term perspective, I think the forefront that we would probably point to is leveraging the UK's academic prowess. We do have a brain trust in this country, not only in the upstream, but also, and as Paul's mentioned, sort of in the midstream segment as well, which is clearly critical. And it is a very dynamic piece. Chemical composition of batteries will change. The way that we produce energy will continue to change. And the UK has always been a front runner when it comes to innovation. And I think that is something that the UK really should redouble efforts in. So really providing that support for universities to go off and do this sort of innovative work that they do best. Because I suppose, we have seen in China, they've thrown a lot of money at the universities and research institutions to now become the leading edge in a lot of the sort of the chemicals and refining the midstream part, because they have made a long-term bet in this segment. And there's absolutely no reason why the UK wouldn't be able to do the same. But again, it would take long-term planning and it would take finance for that to materialize.
If I can add 3 points, the points that just been made. First of all, Tees Valley Lithium was set up as not just a domestic midstream refiner, but also an exporter. So it's in the Tees side Freeport. Mm-hmm. The Freeport provides inbound processing relief, so we can bring high-value material in from South America, process it, use it domestically, and also export to Europe. The second thing you mentioned, how do you offset power costs? Well, when we look at ultra-low power costs, say hydroelectric power in Norway, and nuclear, maybe some parts of France, and others, they don't often come with the cluster effect. And so Teesside has an amazing cluster. That is, you set up there, and some of our products, we've got people who buy them, we've got people who battery energy storage right next door, and we've got all the skills available to us. But the way I think we can secure a long-term future, and this is what the French Prime Minister said at the address, is we've got to get past our productivity slump. We've got productivity flat in this country. And he talked about the French disadvantage for labour productivity. And he said there's 3 ways to solve it. One is robotics, 2 is automation, and the 3rd is AI. And so that's what we're looking at going to the future. We can leapfrog the Chinese by hooking up with offshore wind, having zero carbon electricity, that's low embedded carbon into our product, and use electrochemical technology, which is what Mike and John were referring to, but implement it, operate it using automation, robotics, and AI. That's our future, and that's where our universities and all our skill sets can take us into the future. There's no point in trying to compete with China on a labour versus labour basis. It makes no sense at all. And a slight frustration is the fascination with politicians to put on a hard hat and a high-vis.
We love that.
we would prefer to see you all in a lab coat and in front of a computer using a digital twin operating a plant out of a control room somewhere remote from the plant.
We can probably do that as well.
And for the factory itself to be a dark factory, BYD's cars are made dark factories. No lights, because you don't need any people. So we're just trying to say, how do you compensate for slightly high elevated? You take away the disadvantages. Capture the fact that we're in Europe, and that's the growing market, through a free port. Use the cluster effect, and also go to automation, robotics, and AI.
So can I just check, Mr. King? The planning process at the moment, how long would that take you to get what you want up and running?
Well, we were designated a nationally significant infrastructure project in, I think, it was one of the first decisions that the new government made. So July, August, and we're hoping to get it through before the end of next year. So it's probably a 2-year process. Now that is probably at the quick end of what the historical record for the process is, but that's the time frame within which the project can be ready to start construction. So that's what we're working to.
I mean, it doesn't sound very quick.
Well, no, and you sound like one of our investors, Chairman. But no, I think it's in planning terms, particularly given something. This is a £400 million capex major development. In planning, in a peripheral part of the UK economy. So in planning terms, I think that is relatively quick, given the scale of what we're seeking to deliver down there.
Okay, you're nodding, Mr. Lindberg.
Yeah, just to provide some context to that, 2 years might sound really slow given the urgency of the issues at hand, but if we look globally, let's take copper, for instance, key commodity, that we are seeing a huge supply deficit coming our way. The average from discovery to starting production for a copper mine, global average is 17 and a half years. And within those 17 and a half years, there are plenty of mines that are pushing 20, 25 years. So 2 years, if you get through that, he will be the envy of the global mining industry, put it that way.
And I think the only thing that we need to go we started with the brownfield site. We're repurposing a former China clay pit to now deliver lithium. So all of the things that take all of those early years are actually being dealt with historically. I mean, lithium was first produced in that particular area in the Second World War. It was used in scrubbers for submarines. So it's been going for a long time. But I was talking specifically about this latter part of the planning process.
Very useful, thank you. Anything else?
Just last question, really, around the politics. You're saying government's taking a hand in this area. I mean, you talked a little bit about, it almost felt like very kind of hyper-rational investors making judgments on energy prices and planning and so on. But are you seeing governments distort the market with protectionism, and is that an increase? I'll start with you, Mr. Lindberg, and move across it.
So we do see a trend across the world that governments are very involved in the critical minerals marketplace. We've seen more and more policies put in place. For instance, I mentioned Indonesia earlier, but we've seen in the DRC, in Zambia, and I think Zimbabwe, for instance, where you have export restriction, export bans put in place to essentially try and stimulate more of the value add happening in place. So that there absolutely is, for a lot of the critical minerals that we do need, I'm not sure we can talk about markets because whether they're functioning or not. And there is government intervention across most of these, and especially the more niche ones. Absolutely, we see government direct intervention through policy, or where you have governments that will back companies to make investments in resource-rich countries. We see that especially in Africa, where you might have state-backed companies come in to extract, but also to do infrastructure deals backed by state finance. So absolutely, this is a very challenging dynamic, and especially with companies that then, with listed companies that do not have state backing to compete against those that have state backing.
Mr. King, any views on that?
Well, I mean, I'd have to agree with everything that's said. It's as a small startup company, one of the things that we did is we put together a manifesto about what government could do. And we said, in essence, really, it's the asks. There were 3 simple asks, and all of them were non-financial. But they were around setting a production target that gave investors the confidence that it was going to be both supported and perhaps incentivized. Come back to the planning system, rationalize the planning system to allow it to be expedited. So, that type of direct intervention, which is happening elsewhere in the world. The Inflation Reduction Act was a good example of how it was done in the US, where there was that direct intervention that had an impact in the market, but it was an intervention at a project level that was driving market development.
I would agree with everything that you said. The supply chain concentration is phenomenal. You've got 44% in copper, 98% in manganese being processed in China. So in order to realign supply chains, you need some form of government-backed intervention to allow that to happen. So in whatever form it takes, it's definitely government-supported, government-backed.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we've established some pretty good definitions for critical minerals. We've established that the risk to those minerals is going up. We've understood that protectionism is a rising threat too. Given all of this, and given we need to make recommendations on safeguarding the economic security of our country to Parliament, today, do you think that government strategy is in the right place to safeguard the supply of raw minerals that we need for the future, Mr. Lindberg? You were marking government strategy today. What would you give it out of 10?
I would probably give it, depending on which grading scale we're using, I'd give it a C. It's I think government policy is waking up to the challenges at hand. I think we probably still need a degree of realism injected into the fact that, again, to achieve this realignment that Paul is mentioning, and to secure the UK's access to critical minerals, there is going to require a very concerted effort that goes beyond, if I can be very honest, that goes beyond platitudes. So we've been advising, the UK government in both the current one and the previous one and other governments. And if there's one thing that we do see across especially Western governments is a propensity to talk the talk really well, but not walking the walk. And it's understanding that it is a matter of economic and national and energy security, and that is costly and will take time.
If you were to list the kind of couple of things that government strategy needed to really get sorted, what would those be?
So I think absolutely getting the energy issue, get grips on that. I'd argue the importance of not only continuing to build international partnerships, but also to be willing to put money behind those partnerships. And I think there's a golden opportunity right now with the US administration flip-flopping on the issue. There is a real leadership opportunity for the UK. And it's not a huge investment, but I think, again, it's realising the strength that can be built through partnerships. And I think the UK has made a good start, but I think there is definitely scope for a lot more collaboration with like-minded governments to really deliver these outcomes that we're seeking. The Mineral Security Partnership is, for instance, a great example of that.
Mr. King, where is government strategy today?
I'd probably say C+, B-, a little more. I mean, and I say that because we've benefited from the first equity investment from the National Wealth Fund, which
has
sends the right signal.
Yeah.
But I think we wait with bated breath for the critical mineral strategy, which we believe is about to be published alongside the industrial strategy. We hope that it's going to be a bit more hard-edged than the previous critical mineral strategy, which is rather.
Where do those edges need hardening?
I think I mentioned that they need hardening around establishing a production target, target for the industry to get behind, be it the type of activity that Paul undertakes at Tees Valley or we undertake in Cornwall or the broader industry. I think it needs to make sure that we've talked about the power price, but also the planning system is rationalised. And I think also that if we are going to be producing battery-grade lithium in the UK, that has a tremendous advantage of very positive traceability. So any end user can be guaranteed that has been produced in a well-regulated jurisdiction, almost a traceability standard that's consistent with our main export markets, the EU and other markets that will use that product, is also critically important. And it's stating that not in the form of aspirations, but almost in a quantified form, particularly for the production target.
Helpful. Mr. Atherley?
Oh, I'm a little more generous. I would go A-. I think
it's getting better.
I think Teesside is world class. It's got everything. And if Sarah can fix the energy prices for us,
I'll do my best.
It will be the best in the world. Just on the point that Mike was making, we're looking to export battery-grade hydroxide or carbonate either to the UK or to Europe. We have the Europe's and the world's biggest OEMs coming to us saying we want to buy from Teesside because it's within the European Union, it's within the REACH regulations, it will fit the battery passport, you'll get all the EU benefits, and you're hooked up to offshore wind, therefore you've got arguably the lowest embedded carbon of any hydroxide or carbonate on the planet. Yeah. So everything that Mike was saying, those qualitative factors that we can provide to not just the UK but to Europe, puts us in a very strong position. And again, building on our chemical engineering heritage. So just the energy prices gets us there.
Thank you. Mr. Weston.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned, one of you earlier, about the Inflation Reduction Act and about that massive intervention. Are there any other countries' approaches that you think we can learn from? And I was just looking through some briefing notes about the Japanese Organisation for Metals and Energy Security. I'm interested to know if the UK has anything similar, not that I've heard of, but maybe you can tell me differently.
I can answer that in relation.
The better approach.
I can answer that in relation to rare earths, but not in terms of lithium. So I'm the founder of a company called Pensana, which is just commenced construction on one of the world's biggest undeveloped rare earth mines in Angola. And as you're probably aware, only the Japanese have magnet-making technology outside China. They're the only ones outside China. And we are working with them.
So what type of magnet, you say?
These are the permanent magnets that go inside the axial motors for the electric drive units for an electric vehicle and for the generators and offshore wind turbine. The organisations you're talking about, they are super keen to back developments such as ours, and what we're aiming to do is to try to bring that to the UK. So in answer to the question, yes, we're engaged with them, not with lithium, but with rare earths.
Any other thoughts? Mike King?
Well, no, I think we're engaged with as Paul off-takers around the world in terms of taking our lithium from us. But I think the short answer to your question really is that the UK has to have the confidence, for want of a better word, to invest in its own capacity and capability. And people will engage internationally with us if we have the confidence to do that, as in terms of government policy, government strategy, and government investment that needs to be taken up a tick.
Reminds me of the lithium-ion battery, which of course was invented in Oxford, wasn't it?
Well, there are various people who claim to have invented it. Yeah, I think the Japanese would claim to invent it. But and I think Paul mentioned earlier about all of the different battery chemistries, and we're heavily involved. But almost the one thing that is common to the majority of the battery chemistries that either exist or are emerging is lithium, and so it's a very international marketplace.
Lindberg?
So building on that, I'd return to what I said earlier around funding for academia. I think again that is hugely important and something that we've seen done very well, not only in China but in other jurisdictions as well. So I think again, putting aside adequate funding across the value chain is really, really, really important. And I think the other way, one, appreciating the constraints on the government's purse is also to think about using overseas development assistance and funding for projects abroad, because again, as much as we want try to do in the UK, we need to recognise that a lot of this is not going to happen in the UK, and then using the funding the government has available and deploy that in a way, ensuring that it is done responsibly through the use of responsible standards, for instance, but using ODA or frankly our fairly substantial influence through multilateral development banks to get these projects off the ground across the supply chain is definitely something that HMG should actively consider.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. That's been an extremely clear and lucid panel. I'm really grateful to you for your evidence. That concludes this panel order. Order, welcome to the second panel of today's hearings on economic security. We're going to look now at some questions around the threats to the UK's critical supply chains. Kelvin, Craven, perhaps I could just start with you. Could you just give us, from your point of view, how should Parliament think about critical supply chains? If there's a kind of definition that we should have in mind, what would be the ideas that you would specify?
Good afternoon, Chair. Thank you. Certainly the first point to make, and in my sectors particularly, these are global, highly complex, interconnected supply chains by design. So recent tariff challenges we've seen, we've had tariff-free access to aircraft parts since 1979, and that has meant that over the last 40 years those supply chains have grown ever more dependent, interdependent and interconnected. So that complexity of supply chain is deep. They are also quite opaque because of the commercial sensitivity of the transactions. Most of the larger suppliers in our sectors look for dual sourcing or multi-sourcing on components and parts, and therefore the the sourcing and obtaining of components and parts and raw materials is again something sensitive. So there's a lack of knowledge of those supply chains that makes it very difficult to...
What's the difference between a supply chain and a critical supply chain?
It's a good question. The critical supply chains are those ones that would prevent the majority of your business being carried out. So, for example, in aerospace, that might be the supply of titanium, for example. In shipbuilding, steel, for example. But most of the greatest complexity lies in those component parts where there are sub-assemblies made into assemblies, interchanges across oceans multiple times, and then into final assembly.
I don't know if you think about the number of supply chains that are at stake in your particular industry, but it would be good to get a sense, if you could, what kind of fraction of the supply chains that you work with would you define as critical supply chains? Is it all of them? Is it a fraction of them? How do you think about that?
Very difficult question to answer, but broadly, if you're a prime in the UK in defence, for example, there's a total supply chain of around 6,000 or 7,000 smaller contractors in that supply chain, many of whom will source from abroad. In terms of defining the percentage, you would probably have to go to the raw material elements of that, and again, slightly complicated by the fact that most of our industries take semi-finished materials like alloys that are required for assembly rather than the pure critical minerals. But by tonnage of parts, I would suggest it's probably of the order of, it's a guess, but perhaps an educated one, over a third of those supply chains are critical.
Useful. Trevor, Hutchings, how do you think about this question?
Yes,
what is a supply chain and what's a critical supply chain?
Indeed. I head up the Renewable Energy Trade Association, so we look across the whole of the clean energy sector, which of course has got a number of extended supply chains. One of the characteristics, as the committee will know, as we move from a fuel-intensive energy system to essentially a minerals-intensive energy system, as we move towards solar panels, wind turbines and other technologies, we are reliant on extended supply chains. And I was listening into the previous hearing. Of course, China is a dominant player in a number of the technologies, whether that's in terms of battery technology, whether it's in terms of solar panels and other component parts. So there is definitely a concentration in those particular technologies in China and other international supply chains.
But can I just bring you back to the question? So when you're thinking about supply chains in renewable energy, how do you think about which of the supply chains that are critical and which aren't?
I would say that was a critical supply chain, because without it, undoubtedly there would be higher costs and potentially input constraints to the big hike that we're having in solar, wind and other technologies. So that one I would say was critical because it is concentrated in a few countries. And of course we've benefited as the UK in the vast manufacturing capability that China has in terms of lower prices and availability. So the fact that we've got 50% clean electricity today is partly because we have exploited those supply chains. But I don't think anyone feels particularly comfortable in being over-reliant on a single critical supply chain that you talked about, which is why we'd very much like to see the diversity of that, the homegrown supply chains that were mentioned in the previous hearing. But also, I think one area that hasn't been touched upon enough is this area of the circular economy. So a lot of those supply chains are for critical materials coming into this country. Once that material is here, we need to extract greater value from it by retaining it here, recycling, reusing, and of course over time that will reduce our dependence on those sorts of critical supply chains that we talked about. But it is different for other technologies as well. So we've got the renewable energy space has got a number of technologies beyond wind and solar, of course, and many of those are less reliant on some of those international supply chains.
Okay, thank you. Antony Walker, what's your view on the difference between a supply chain and a critical supply chain?
I think, from a broader kind of technology and digital sector perspective, supply chains become critical when you suddenly get a scarcity. And I think what we've seen over recent years is that can be sometimes difficult to predict. In terms of you might have multiple causes of that. We saw issues emerge through the pandemic. We had just the discussion earlier around critical minerals and rare earth minerals, and it's interesting that rare earth minerals becoming a little bit more difficult to access from China more recently as a result of China's response to US tariffs. The nature of the digital technology sector is, first of all, most of the sector's value in the UK is at the services layer, but all of it is dependent upon a product layer. Those products have huge amounts of minerals and incorporated into them, and they're sourced mostly from Asia. So you can see moments at any particular time where you can get a particular scarcity. The obvious area that has been the huge focus of government, I suppose, is in terms of chips themselves. Yeah. And I think that was a lot of lessons learned from the pandemic period. But again, I think it's difficult there to see a solution where the UK ends up having its own supply in terms of chips. We're going to be reliant on global markets, and therefore we've got to really think about take a very strategic view of how the markets operate and how in terms of your strategic relationships with key countries that can meet your demand for those kind of products. And I think that's where we're sort of seeing government focus.
Thank you. Pederson, what do you think about this question?
So I'll go at it from a port's point of view. So for us, in terms of the critical supply chain, it is really ranked in terms of products, and we unfortunately have some experience through COVID. So it was much about ranking the products coming in and out of the ports, and mainly in where you had with food and energy, all the way over to non-essentials like hair gel, right? So for us, it was very much prioritizing this, just in terms of what is important for the country at any given time in a crisis. So from a port's point of view, that is how we will view it. We are not the one best place to say whether it's rare earth, et cetera, materials that are most critical for the supply chain. So for us, it will always be this hand-in-glove coordination with government. What is critical for the country at any given point in time?
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Chair. Just interested to hear your views on what you think of the current threats to critical national infrastructure, and whether you think these challenges have actually become harder to respond to. So, Trevor Hutchings.
I think there are four sort of headline threats, risks to energy as critical national infrastructure. I think the cyber risk, which the committee will be familiar with. I think there is that reliance on concentrated supply chains in some particular areas, as per the previous question. I think the exposure of our energy infrastructure to the impacts of our changing climate, so more severe and intense weather events, whether that's flooding, high winds, storm damage, that is going to become more prevalent as it is now. And we can see the disruption that already causes. And I also think there is a interdependence now of the energy system with other parts of the economy, so telecommunications, for example, where more of our energy system is reliant on telecommunications. Smart metering would be an obvious example. So I think there's a number of threats there, but the point I would make is that I do believe a energy system that is moving towards a renewable energy is fundamentally more secure than perhaps a system that we've had previously, because it is isolating us from international energy markets and price volatility that we've seen through the energy crisis. It is a decentralized system where we have fewer points of single failure. It is reliant on uninterruptible sources, certainly by state actors like the sun and the wind. So I think inherently, yes, it's more intricate as an energy system, but it actually inherently is more secure overall. But we've got to manage those risks that I talked about.
Spain, correct me if I'm wrong, but Spain and Portugal have a large amount of renewable energy in their mix already, don't they? And yet they had this power outage, which I think affected about half their network. Do you think that could happen here?
I think we've certainly got a more complex system to manage going forward. But I think the UK system, headed up by the NESO, the National Energy System Operator, is a very robust system. It's been hugely reliant historically. I don't think the move to renewables is any way weakening that. And in fact, as I say, I think it's actually strengthening our security because it is less reliant on any single point of failure. I don't think we've actually fully got to the bottom of what happened in the Iberian Peninsula. I think it's very easy to too quickly jump on the bandwagon that it's all down to the fact that it's a heavily dominant or dominated renewable system. I think we need to wait and see what the full inquiry of that is. But as I say, I'm confident that the way that we're managing the UK system, that the risk of that happening is very, very low.
Pederson.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that the rapid process towards renewable energy will make it that much more secure. I think if you go too fast, you inject other risk into the system, because I'm not sure the grid, the transformation, etc., can actually keep up with this. So if you get too fast, too soon with this, I think you inject some other risk that we don't like to discuss today. I think there's a lot to be said in any business scenario, having resilience from variety of sources. And I think that is true for our energy system today as well. We should, of course, progress with the energy transition, but it's an energy transition, it's not an energy cut-off, because if you do it too soon, the backbone is not there. That still means you can buy energy from many places around the world, and of course you want to be sure as a government which countries you rely on, and you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, which you actually don't need on energy. Maybe on other components you need to go to a single big country. So I do think this here is something where it requires us to take a step back. I also think that it's easy to talk about the energy transition and not think about the cost. Because we heard on the previous panel that one of the biggest issues we have with economic security in the nation today, that is the cost of energy. Even compared to Europe, that will not go away. And I heard the previous panel talk about it will help if we give bigger subsidies. But I think that's a carve-out in terms of the real solution, because that is just taking money from elsewhere in the system or taxation, etc. I don't think that's the real solution. So I think a step back and look at energy in a much broader perspective. I do think this is important. We will never, also with Desna's own prediction, we will never not use oil and gas. that we have to remember, because it's called net zero. It's not a zero, so it's a net zero. And we still have resources out in the North Sea today, which is our own, as much as the sun and the wind here in the country. And that's a different part of putting in resilience. I'm from Denmark, and I've seen a lot of discussions about the Baltics, where they basically dig up the cables, both in terms of IT cable and power cables. So once you do that, you cut from the offshore wind farms. But if you take it in by vessel with oil product, gas, green ammonia, well, you can blow one vessel out of the water, so to speak, but the next vessel will come. So that's a very different resilience. So I do think it needs to be looked at much more holistic, and I think...
It applies to Nord Stream gas pipeline as well, doesn't it? These are vulnerable, you can have attacks on those as well. Can I just broaden this actually, and say broaden? I want to understand your views on state actors, state threats to, say, our port system, how they could bring about a closure of ports, for example. Yeah. What tools you think and what security you have in place?
So our emergency response, our plans, and whether that is a bad state actor or not, we look at how do we operate the port without IT? How do we operate the port without power? Whether that is induced by an accident or unfriendly fire, we still need to do it. So that is how we plan it on a port level. And then also, because we are an island nation, we will need the ports. But I also think it is important from a resilience point of view, which is my same point as with energy. We have many different sources in terms of ports, because we have many ports around the country. So you can take out one port, but you will not be able to take out all of them. So Holland, Netherlands, you have 2 ports. Rotterdam, by far the biggest, right? Belgium, Zeebrugge and Antwerp. But here we have many big ports around all our coast. That actually gives some resilience, which I think is quite important for the UK.
Craven, can I just ask you, in terms of your view, ADS sector, what do you think in terms of the threats out there, in terms of whether it be state or whether it be grey actors operating on behalf of states, and resilience and monitoring in the defence and aerospace sector?
Yes, so the hostile state actor threats are threefold. It's not just the cyber, it's physical intrusion, and then there's espionage and disruption within as well. So the defence sector particularly has a very complex, lengthy supply chain, as we've discussed, and that provides a very large target area. So protection is difficult. One of the things that we do is work very closely with the agencies and the authorities. I suspect that there could be better intelligence sharing between them, greater collaboration with industry around those threats to help mitigate and prevent those sorts of attacks. There are other shocks to those supply chains and that critical infrastructure. We've talked about critical minerals, but disruptions like the war in Ukraine, COVID, those introduced huge shocks in the supply chain, which generally take somewhere in the region of 18 months to 2 years to work through and source alternative supply chains or restore existing supply chains. So again, there's some thought to be given to how do you build stockpiles or different alternate sources of supply as well.
Do you think your members are well plugged into the various agencies to help them in their protection, say, against?
It's pretty good at the large company end. I would suggest that the SMEs struggle with their day-to-day doing business at the moment, and that therefore some of these threats are perhaps less of a priority for them.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. And I might just switch around what I'd indicated, just because I was going to build on what you were just saying about obviously the challenges around the supply chains. But I just wondered, and I'll ask the whole panel if they could comment on this. But so we know that supply chains are vulnerable. How do you monitor the situation across that? So, does that sit with your board? Does that sit with some person within the company who has that responsibility? And so how do you manage that monitoring process around that risk to supply chain? And if I could start with you, Kelvin, thank you.
So risk management generally covers the typical threats that we would see in this business, and they would generally report into the board, and the board would monitor those on a monthly basis. And you would normally see the top 10 risks published on an annual basis, and those, in my experience, those risk mitigation plans are studied pretty closely. As you go down the chain from the listed to the very small and medium-sized enterprises, that requirement probably devolves to an individual within an organisation, who's probably doing risk management on the side of a day job. So the efficacy of that is challenging. There is help, so there is tools and support from MOD, people like ourselves, but there probably could be more to be done around that.
And if I could ask others on the panel, because I think defence naturally sort of are slightly more alive to that type of risk potentially. So if I could ask you, Trevor, what do you think about the monitoring success?
Yeah, as a number of the operators in the energy space are operators of critical national infrastructure, they are obliged through a number of regulations and forthcoming strengthening of regulations, particularly in terms of cybersecurity, to have a pretty comprehensive regime in place to understand the risks, and taking regular contact and guidance from government, from the National Cybersecurity Centre. There's training, there is reporting, there's threat intelligence sharing. So there's quite a comprehensive regime in place at the moment. Again, to the point that is largely the bigger players within the energy system. I think, though, with the heightened awareness and potentially heightened risk with the geopolitical situation, more needs to be done in that area around sharing and reporting, and ensuring that and making sure the government is secure and the national energy system operator is reassured that the companies in the supply chain are following those rules. There's compliance with that, and so I don't think it's an area that we can in any way become complacent on.
Thank you. Antony, do you have anything to add?
Very, very similar. I think large players have a very sophisticated view of what their supply chains look like, but then as you get down to kind of smaller companies, I think that will become they probably have less of a forward view, but I think, but particularly in terms of the CNI kind of designated operators, I think that kind of risk assessment basis is pretty strong.
And finally,
so part of the supply chain in terms of support is back to the emergency response plans that I mentioned. So from a risk and compliance officer to the executive board, up to our board of directors, and also our audit committee, but then also because we operate 3 critical national infrastructures within the company, we are also audited every year by the Department of Transport, which I actually think works quite well. And I will also say, you do sense that every year they step up their requirements, as we as a company have to step up our requirements every year, because it does become more difficult.
So do you think that there's any more role that the government could be playing in this area? I mean, obviously, I'm sure they could be providing certain amounts of support within the supply chains that you mentioned, but is there anything in particular that you could cite that the government could do more of in light of that?
For me, it's probably the conversation to have whether the National Cybersecurity Council, whether they should give advice or they should mandate, and thereby following up. They give advice and they send out advice. We are quite alert to that. So we follow their advice, and we actually try to do more than what is recommended. But I don't know if there's other companies that are less alert to this and hope that they can avoid the cost and inconvenience of doing it. So I think that is something that will be pretty important, what the country wants. Is this a guidance, or is it now so critical from everything you see also behind closed doors that you want to mandate that more to companies? And there, as a little bit what the panel is alluding to here, the bigger companies will probably already be a little bit further ahead, but they will probably also still have more financial capacity to do it. So for small and medium companies, if you mandate more, we just need to make sure that we don't take them out of business from a competitive situation.
Did anybody else want to add anything to that before I move on to another piece?
I think there's a couple of areas where certainly this point about encouraging the circular economy to reduce our reliance on extended supply chains, and actually the homegrown industrial strategy. In energy at the moment, we have a sustainable industry bonus, which is part of the support mechanism, CFD support mechanism for technologies like offshore wind. There is an additional payment if you can have more of your supply chain in the UK. That payment could be a mechanism that could be expanded to other technologies within the energy sector. So a really concrete example there. And the one area I would say that we are falling behind on, where the government needs to do more on, is the climate adaptation planning on the energy system, reducing our exposure to severe weather events. The Committee on Climate Change recently, was quite critical on the lack of progress in that area.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything?
I was just going to add that this question touches on a number of government departments, and of course cross-departmental collaboration is always challenging. So we do think and would recommend that certainly at an economic security level that a coordinating body located either in DBT or the Cabinet Office would be a sensible thing, who could also then perhaps provide better interface with industry.
Thank you.
I agree with that. I think, to sort of broaden out a little bit from the sort of supply chain risks to the wider kind of economic security piece, I think we just have the sense that we're operating in a far more complex, far more interdependent, but also more fragmented world. And I think having where, not everybody has a kind of complete view about what's happening kind of across an ecosystem, and that's true on the industry side. I think it's also true across government, and I think ensuring that kind of the joined up nature of kind of coordination across government, bringing together DBT, MOD, DCIT, Treasury, Foreign Office and so on, to make sure you've got that kind of comprehensive view about what economic security kind of really means from the level of kind of supply chains through to kind of wider geopolitical risks, I think is going to be really important in ensuring that we're able to be kind of fleet of foot in a much more kind of dynamic geopolitical environment.
So let me put another question then that sort of picks up on the point that you've just made. So we've heard information which is very useful from Boston Consulting Group, and they've looked at the estimates for how much capital investment is going to be needed in various sectors. So between 363 and 583 billion pounds in additional capital to meet the growth needs. And obviously we need to ask a question about where that capital is coming from. So, if we look, their estimates are 179 billion is the minimum that they expect for renewables, for example, or in commercial industrial, it's 155 billion. That's their minimum level. Digital, 65 billion. So if that investment is coming from foreign companies, where do you think that we need to be concerned and why, basically? And do you want to start, Antony, and then I'll go around the panel?
Yeah, look, I think when we look at these economic security issues, we come from the position that the UK needs to be, and has always been and must remain one of the most open economies in the world. That was our starting point, and that's our real strength. But we also need to be one of the most secure as well. So if you're going to be open, you've got to be really, really thoughtful about how you make sure that you have this kind of economic security approach. To be open, we have to be open to foreign investments. That's going to be absolutely critical for all the reasons that you just set out. And I think this is where it comes back to, therefore, having a really kind of strategic view about which countries you really want to partner with, recognising that you might be seeking to attract investment from parts of the world where kind of values might be different. So you might have to take a view on where you're willing to accept investment from some parts of the world and where you're not. But the key thing is having that joined up view, and I think that comes back to.
Is there a joined up view across government today or not?
I think it's evolving. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
That sounds like no, not yet.
No, but I think we're making. There's a lot more progress towards building it, I think, than over the last couple of years. So I wouldn't say there's nothing happening, but I think we're still kind of coming to the point of building that view. And I think recent developments over recent weeks in terms of trade agreements with the US, with the European Union, with India, and so on, are all kind of good examples, I think, of the government sort of thinking, okay, who can we cooperate with around the world on a really kind of dependable basis. But I think that's also why industrial strategy is so important, because what we're seeing, I think we heard the example of China, where it's very clear that their industrial strategy is also an economic security and a national security strategy all in one. And I think we have to make sure that these aspects of economic security are really built into our international trade strategy and our industrial strategy, so they're all joined up and linked.
Thank you. Henrik, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I can build on what Antony said in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. We do not have the fiscal firepower as they have in the US and EU, and I don't think we need it. What we need is to start to execute on the fundamentals. And what I mean is we need to get the regulation and the planning regime much more fit for purpose. We need to see that as a competitive tool to attract inwards investment in the country. We can't give grants to everybody who wants to come in and set up shop. So we do need to make it much easier, much more predictable, and much more timely to invest. I hear a lot about regulation and planning, but it does not filter into hard actions on the ground. So you might have a policy statement, but that does not mean that planning is moving faster on the ground. So from all the countries I have done infrastructure projects in, this is really, really difficult here. And I do think we really need to put some focus on it. The good thing about regulation and also in terms of planning is it doesn't cost a lot. It's capital light to actually change it. It's just hard work. And you will need to disappoint some groups in society, but that is what the leadership is about. Then you need to have certainty of projects for the inwards investors. You can't tell them to come and build a factory here that will last for another 20 or 30 years if you don't only promise them work or commercial outlook to 3 or 4 years of work. It won't work. So you need to have that long-term certainty of projects. And then the last one is the trade agreement with EU and US. Now, what we need is we need to implement the EU new trade agreement that came up. But already now we need to ask ourselves, what comes after this? Because from a pure trading point of view, it is far from what it was being inside. So there's more work to be done, but that needs to be started in parallel. Same with the US trade agreement. It's very, very good compared to April 2nd. It is really not good compared to April 1st. So we need to get it implemented, but there needs to be other teams working on what comes next. But I also do think if we fix those fundamentals, I think we have ample of potential to attract, billions of foreign investment from the right companies and the right states into the country. But not fixing the fundamentals, you will not be able to change it.
Thank you. Would you like to comment, Trevor?
Yeah, I'm just building much of what has been said. I think we are not going to get this clean energy transition done without huge amounts of capital investment, much of which will be foreign. I think it's the obligation on the government to really be clear on what are the strategic priorities, what is the risk, but actually to make this a really attractive place to invest, so that we are, diversifying, spreading that risk across different investor types, different countries, different nations, but having a regime and framework in place as there is today to be able to halt or call in particular projects where the threshold has been exceeded. But it's got to be government that sets that threshold.
Thank you.
Can I just check, though, is it clear enough whether we should be taking significant investment from China into the renewable energy infrastructure?
I mean, my members are, I think they're satisfied with the current regime, but I don't think it is clear enough on what is an acceptable level of investment in a particular subsector, particular technology, any particular industry. I think that is an area that I would prefer to see more clarity from government on assessing the risk and then setting out what is the acceptable thresholds.
Do your members have a view about the wisdom of taking significant Chinese investment into the renewable infrastructure?
I think there's mixed views on that. I don't think that there is a single view. It's about what does it look strategically, about whether we're taking on the potential for foreign interference, but it comes down to how much in what particular subsector, what leverage is there, what risk is there. And as I say, I think that the government has a role in establishing what that level of threshold is acceptable.
At the moment, that strategic take from government perhaps isn't there.
It's not clear enough.
Mr. Craven, anything to add?
Briefly, access to capital for the small and medium-sized enterprises that we have in our sectors is very difficult anyway, and given the sort of current challenges of operating businesses, that's hard. But from a national economic resilience point of view, particularly in defence, the MOD is already thinking about how the open nature of our marketplace needs to be translated into a requirement that says onshore British factories, British jobs, British IP is used in supplying to the MOD, which is a good thing.
Okay. Thank you. The challenge that we've got is we have a situation in our country today where you've got substantial private management of public risk. And everybody agrees that the risk levels are going up. We don't have a clear definition of threat from the government. We don't have a clear definition of economic security. We don't have the Secretary of State for Business and Trade on the National Security Council. And it feels as if that we need to take a total defence approach to economic security, which means that the public sector and the private sector probably have to work much more closely together in the future. I'm not sure we have a forum for that, but we do have an Industrial Strategy Council coming soon. So can I just ask, do you think we do need a space where the public sector and the private sector are thinking about risk, scenarios, wargaming together? And is the creation of the Industrial Strategy Council an opportunity to build that forum? Mr. Craven, do you want to just give us an initial view?
Absolutely agree with you, Chairman, that we do need such a forum. My understanding of the Industrial Strategy Council is it's very much focused on horizontal themes across the growth sectors that have been identified in places like skills. So threats to our economic security could be one of those themes. They would probably require some form of official department or resource in terms of a coordinating body to enact that thinking and that work. But certainly greater collaboration with industry where there is a large number of experts in the space would be a very good thing.
Hutchings?
I think we already enjoy a really close public-private partnership in the energy sector with regulated industries providing much of our infrastructure today. So there is a basis on which to build, but I agree the sentiment that I think there is more to be done in ensuring joined-up government, joined-up thinking on the threats that we face.
Mr. Walker?
I'm not sure that the Industrial Strategy Council is the right mechanism, partly because it's got lots of other things to do that are also kind of really important. And I'm not entirely sure whether you can I think you might have to have a sectoral level to this as well. One of the things we suggested is that there should be a sort of international technology task force that would bring together the kind of key bits of government together with security agencies to kind of coordinate around industrial strategy, trade policy and economic security issues to sort of triangulate at that level. And my sense is that, I mean, just if you hear the sort of, there's commonality, but there's the very specific differences between everybody on this panel today. I think to get to a meaningful level, you're probably going to have something at a sectoral level as well for sort of core sectors.
That new space is needed or not needed?
Absolutely needed, because I think you've got to start to bring these elements together and recognise that the risks we face are so multifaceted. The only way I think you can try to be responsive is if you're really joined up across public, private sector, and if you've got the kind of international dimension as well as the domestic dimension.
Pederson, what's your view? You talked about an existing close relationship with the DFT already, but I mean...
Yes. So now I am actually a member of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, and I do not think it's the right forum for what you're suggesting here. We have seen some green shoots in terms of cooperation. So right now we are operating for the armed forces, the MOD, the Army down in Marchmouth military port. So that is the first port where we all operated for the Army. But the Army and us, we actually announced only a couple of months ago a framework agreement. So now the Army actually have access to 21 ports, so north, south, east, west in the country, which of course will lower their logistics costs so they can spend that for other things, but that also means more resilience should one port be taken out. Yep. So I think there's plenty of room for having these public-private partnership that actually works. I think the Army are very, very supportive of us, how we service them, and we are very supportive of and proud of serving them. Then there's another thing which I have brought up on the Industrial Strategy Council, which goes a little bit hand in hand with some mention here. That is that I think we need to be much more as a country assertive in terms of what is it actually we want to bring in of business in the country, not only on the renewable energy parts, but across that. Also, what are the homegrown companies we want to support? If you look at the WTO rules, US is a member, China is a member, Germany is a member, France is a member, but they just seem to interpret the rules a lot different than we do. So we're playing according to the same rules, but they always favor their companies, homegrown industries. And now, I've only lived here for 7 years, but I do not understand why we don't do that in this country here. I think it's a huge opportunity for being more resilient. I think it's a huge opportunity for create economic growth in this country. Again, it's a little bit like regulation and planning. It's not that sexy for the lawyers to go through the WTO rules, but layman standing on the side, I do not see us play with the same rules as the other ones, and I think we are losing out on it. Yeah. So I think there's some of this.
That's very helpful. I have to say, after 21 years in the House of Commons, I don't understand the answer to that question either. So it's that is about to conclude our panel, but Mr. Maynard,
yes,
after you have asked your question.
Mr. Pederson, 5 port operators control those 120 ports, give or take. Is there any bigger risk than a kind of coordinated IT attack on all 5 at once?
No. To the best of my knowledge, I do not see all 5 port groups being taken out at the same time. That I don't, because I don't think we're on the same network, we're not on the same software. So I actually do think this is where the UK is more resilient than some other countries, where the ports are bigger and have a bigger proportion of the cargo, which of course help with unit cost. But from a resilience point of view, I actually think this is where, from what I know, I could imagine the country is quite resilient from a scenario you're mentioning here.
Is there anything worse than that on your radar screen, apart from kind of an IT attack on all 5 at once, that is kind of at your top of your risk list?
So the top, except for staff safety, but then it is loss of power, loss of IT. that is what we always try to go through. And I think those are worse than some of the climate changes, which we also, of course, addressing, but they are a little bit more long-term than that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for being candid and clear with us. That's been incredibly helpful. That concludes this. Welcome to this final panel on today's hearings on the economic security of our country. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this third panel, which is looking at emerging technologies and cyber security. Mr. Parker, perhaps I could just start with you. Do you basically think that defending our national security means that we've got to retain a technology lead over our rivals in this world?
In terms of the United Kingdom, we have a challenge there because the emergence of IT in terms of the sector has only been 25 years or so of really great accelerated growth, and the large amount of that in terms of what's used in the Western world is of course originated mostly in the United States of America. That doesn't mean that's a negative because it just means that is actually a hub for design and engineering. What the UK does extremely well is know how to put those technologies together, like we've always done traditionally in other sectors. So the United Kingdom, due to other sectors such as finance lead, insurance lead, and some of the other great things we do in our country, we can leverage that technology, which may well originate elsewhere. But if you think, for example, Fortinet, my company, has a British global CISO sat in California, and there's many other examples, I'm sure, from other panel members and people across the sector will say it seems to be almost borderless in terms of the way that the technology people move around and design.
Is it therefore impossible for us to maintain a technology lead over our rivals in today's world?
I would say to catch up at this stage would be exceptionally difficult. It's a bit like when we compare it to our normal daytime use of any computer. Those are using systems that are well established. What tends to happen, which is perhaps not aware in the wider community outside our sector, is there's an awful lot of trust and sharing going on inside the sector. And that's one big piece that today I think would be a really valuable deduction, is that behind the curtain, if you like, there is an awful lot of sharing, collaboration, trusted work that's going on. And it was actually quite a small sector. A lot of people know each other. I also find it quite highly ethical as a sector. Having worked in other sectors, it's one of the most ethical I've ever seen in my working life. So on the basis of trusted, international collaboration, the need and requirement for us to emerge as some leading country, I personally don't see there. No.
Okay. Rita, what's your view?
Yeah, I would say that when we look into the kind of technology sector, it could be very rewarding for a country to be ahead of certain innovations, but we also have to remember that as you kind of adapt new technology innovations, there are also risks. For example, we see artificial intelligence be a subject that is very, very much spoken in organisations here in the UK. We want to take those technologies that can bring the UK a lot forward. But the reality is there could be risks in it. So, for example, not fully understanding the digital supply chain of those technologies. But again, there is great advantage in that.
Okay. Thomas.
Yeah, so I come from quite a different perspective, because obviously being a hardware manufacturer, then I kind of see things a little bit differently. And in terms of national security for the UK and technology, I mean, does the technology advantage deliver what we want? Well, it always will, because those that are in the lead have always got the edge. But what does that actually mean? We can talk about security in IT, but actually, where does security come from? IT doesn't run without hardware. And when we think about the future of all these different wonderful technologies that are coming along, what is it that's actually going to drive them? Software is always going to be developed. But as you can see now, particularly with AI, as just been mentioned, the hardware is the bottleneck. And I see, if you like, national security and technological security as being the control over the critical components. And here today, critical components mean things that go to the core of what you're trying to deliver. I'm in the semiconductor world, so semiconductor chips are one of those examples. But even if you look at quantum or AI, there are specific types of devices required that come from specific material sets or specific technologies that sit at the heart of them. So if we were to start thinking about what does national security for the UK mean, given that, and I like to use this term quite a lot, that we are the innovation nation, we should be able to take hold of those critical components and use them to our advantage. And I don't mean an advantage that's a threat. I mean an advantage that's a hand-holding, shaking hand exercise. You know, we've got this, how would you like to work together? We have a critical component, how do we work together in a secure way? So while I do agree the software side is so important, we've also got to look at those layers that go underneath that actually deliver that critical capability. So for me, yes, definitely, it's the way in which national security is handled in the UK is, with regards to technology, is critically important. But I'd really like to take the conversation towards what does that mean in terms of what we have to deliver and what we have to control.
Dr. Casey.
I think critical technologies have potential to significantly impact the UK's prosperity, security and global leadership. And we come from the kind of really cutting-edge technology perspective, so things like quantum technologies underpinned by semiconductors and photonics. They will be key for national security and critical national infrastructure. I think when you look at quantum technologies coming through that will transform communications, computing, imaging, sensing, to help us ensure that our infrastructure and services such as healthcare, transportation, environmental sustainability and security are fit for the challenges of the future. And I think we are leading in these areas like quantum, and we should embrace that and support that fully.
Yeah, super. I'm going to move through these questions quite quickly now, just because there's going to be a vote in the House shortly as the opposition debate concludes. But let me come to Sarah. Let me come to Matt Weston.
How do you think government should balance the need for national security protections whilst also fostering a technological, or rather the emerging technology sector? So maybe Chris Parker.
Yes, and it's always a dynamic. I would also say that there's a healthy dynamic of positive stress, which as opposed to negative stress can be uncomfortable. The positive stress means that there's always that healthy balance between regulation and also an enormous amount of industry collaborative work that goes on already globally. Again, returning to my point, it's cybersecurity especially does not respect borders at all. It's a very much a global problem, global issue. We can look at data, and there's some very good data out in the public domain. Most companies do produce those. Fortinet produced a FortiGuard Labs report recently, which has some superb data out in the public space of exactly what needs to be done. But back to that point, to that balance you asked about, the biggest need is for collaboration and for people just to talk and communicate. And I see a lot of that. I have to do a lot of that as well. And that's part of our duty in our sector, but also our ability to secure our customers and people everywhere is only through collaboration with the national agencies on quite a regular basis. You'll probably not be surprised to hear we can't talk about the ways that happens, but the regularity of it is impressive.
Dr. Brennan Casey and then Dr. Simon Thomas.
I would echo that. I think collaboration and transparency of the process and good communication would be key, as I would see it.
Thank you. Simon Thomas?
Yeah, from my perspective, coming from a specific type of company that's been VC backed in order to get our technology to the level it is, then I completely agree with what's been said. But on top of that, if we want to ensure that we get these technologies to a state where we can use them properly in this country, then we have to make sure that those technologies succeed. Because if they don't succeed here, they'll succeed somewhere else. So I think the way in which investment screening, for example, is looked at today is not quite correct, because quite often that screening happens at the point of investment, the most critical point for a company that's trying to push its runway out, and that's when the investigation starts. I completely agree with having a more open beneficial approach where the government and the company can work together over time, maybe even starting at the start of the company, inception of the company, so that the technology is understood by the government as we move through the different phases. And also I think that would add a level of knowledge to the civil service about what type of technology people are developing and how it can be used. So I don't think people, particularly in invested companies, would be averse to being questioned at early stage if they knew it was going to be useful and collaborative going forward.
And it would aid investment or funding coming through.
Yes.
Thanks, Chair. Charlie Maynard.
Yes, Simon, if I can continue there, and then to Brendan, if it's all right. Does the UK currently have the right approach to controlling the export of sensitive technologies? I'm interested to hear kind of your experiences in your two lines of work.
So today, we've not really had any, other than obviously having to comply with dual use. That's a big thing for us, particularly the cutting edge where we are. But in terms of, I think we could have better trade deals. I think that's probably, but everyone's fully aware of that.
Say that again, Dr. Thomas.
We have better trade deals, which the government is working on right now. Mm-hmm. But in terms of technology borders, it's very clear. There are certain technologies you can't sell to certain states, and as long as you're aware of that, then it's quite straightforward from my perspective. Yep.
I would agree it's not something that we've had an issue with. It's something you need to be aware of and comply with and ensure that you do it correctly, but we haven't found it as a particular issue, so I would completely agree with Simon on that.
And does anybody on the panel have a particular view as to kind of our approach compared to the US CFIUS approach and pros and cons, and what you see we might have an advantage over or disadvantage over compared to their approach?
So from my perspective, we have a US subsidiary in San Diego, and the CFIUS rules are obviously a lot more strict. Yep. I think that if we're looking at proliferation and progress of technology, then I believe the UK has a better setup. Whether that offers the level of protection that the US have, that's the balance that we have to look into. But right now, companies like Paragraph, for example, we're very, very aware of IP. We're very, very aware of technology control because it's our value. So we want to keep it ourselves. So we are very well aligned with, if you like, UK strategy and wanting to make sure that IP or that technology remains within our control. But in terms of, we have run across some CFIUS instances which require a lot more paperwork. We definitely know that. But we've not really had any specific troubles yet.
Thank you.
So we know that the American national security strategy quite explicitly entails a plan to try and slow down China when it comes to China developing advanced technologies, and therefore in the conversations that no doubt are going on in trying to get a trade deal with the United States agreed, there will be questions about whether the UK should be doing more to join in with that American-led strategy. Is that a good idea, and is it possible, Mr. Parker?
Well, you'd expect me not to comment on geopolitical balance. It's actually what I would offer is it's more my view is that, again, back to technology, if it's set up correctly and used efficiently, should protect against all threats, and that's the goal of certainly quite a few people in the sector every day of the week, try and make sure that happens. So when it comes to a state actor, and again the CEO of the NCSC recently at the Cyber UK on stage, on record and still available online, cited China as the big threat that we've got to cope and tangle with. So everyone knows that is the challenge. The particular challenge I think we've got to do internally in the sector and in the UK is to make sure we are set up to make sure we can secure against any threat that might disturb our national prosperity. And to be honest, in the sector, certainly the technology end of things, people are pretty apolitical. They focus very clearly on the threat, because it's not just state actors. There are also now lots of criminal actors and gangs, as we've seen in this country very recently, which can cause an awful lot of damage. So the sector tends to be focused on the technological threat and defeating it, and that is being done day on day on. And I would say where it comes from is certainly part of our threat analysis and what we analyse, but it doesn't feed so much into a political level. It feeds much more into a technological level.
Yeah. Any other views from others on that?
Yeah, I'd completely agree. I mean, we have to remember that China, Iran, Russia are definitely targets to the UK. We've seen a 150% increase in targeting of China to a number of sectors globally last year. But going back to what we said here, there's a number of other threat actors still interested in the UK. E-crime have become more sophisticated and more targeting, but we also have new tactics such as, IT fake workers from North Korea targeting UK entities at the moment as well. So the cyber landscape we have at the moment can be quite complex. It's ever evolving and shifting.
Very interesting. Is the implication then that we've got to be on guard against protecting ourselves against the wrong peril?
I think exactly, yes, continuously. And again, that landscape literally day by day continuously evolves.
Interesting. And do you think we're therefore giving enough attention to the threat from cyber criminals?
I think it depends where you look into it. If you look into, for example, the NCSC, they're doing a great amount of work to make sure that individuals are very aware of it. But the reality is, we've suddenly heard a lot in the media over the last few weeks. It's continuous. So it's not just what we see in the media, it's continuous in the background. So maybe that hasn't gone down to every single public entity or every single organisation realising that they need to start resourcing for security protections as well.
George Thomas?
Yeah, I just go back to my field, the hardware side of stuff. Completely agree what's been said here, but in terms of aligning with specific export and import or investment regulations, I would just urge a bit more pragmatism to try and understand what it is we want or what we define as sensitive technologies, and in the future where we think those partners need to be. Because if we don't look at least try and forward plan where we want to put our critical technologies or those critical components I talked about, then we may find if we align with other people's rules, we can't access those markets or even more critically get those things that we want and need for national security.
The implication is not to be just sort of purely demand-led when it comes to investment. Actually, let's be a bit smarter about where we want to secure forward investment from.
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting. Dr. Casey, anything to add to that?
I don't think I have anything further to add.
Sarah Edwards?
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering, Chris and Zeki, could you perhaps describe a bit more the types of threat that we are faced with and how those threats over the last few years from a cybersecurity perspective have transformed or morphed? And so are we able to sort of chart the change? So where are we, where have we been, where are we now, and where might we be going?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the first good bit of news is that we do know the threat because the threat is continuously scanned and monitored and actually passed around, certainly in our case in Fortinet, to all devices globally. So there's an awful lot of automation, which we do hear about as a negative thing in terms of the threat to AI and everything else. We've been using AI in Fortinet for a decade, just haven't been necessarily telling everyone about it quite rightly, and nor do we share quite rightly a lot of the detail of what we do. But back to that threat piece, the biggest development, really, the things that are leaping forward now because of this automation, are really the sort of the underworld, those sites, the dark sites that people hear about but actually do exist and fortunately are monitored as well. That it's things that are now becoming almost too easy for people to buy. So they can buy exploit kits, you can go and just do that, and you can go and work out how to do it, and you can also ransomware as a service. So bizarrely people can go and actually how to do their criminal acts and actually outsource it. You've also got cybercrime as a service, so people doing those things. So people who are malicious actors are doing those things. So in terms of the broad view, if I give you that first, there's now an uptake certainly in that automation and almost the commercialisation of crime. But again, I know that our agencies in the UK and also a hell of a lot of contribution between the 3 Eyes, 5 Eyes and the wider community does make sure that that is kept at bay.
Thank you.
I mean, the reality is it's still as simple as dealing with hacktivists, e-crime, and nation states. But the reality is, especially when we talk about nation states and criminal actor groups, there's going to be a lot more of them. They have seen the success over the last few years, especially during the pandemic, where we started to see a lot of organizations being targeted. They've seen that success, taken that opportunity, and they're increasing the targeting. The biggest concern for me is the increase in sophistication. Year on year, they're becoming more sophisticated. They're becoming a lot more quicker. Give you an idea that we continuously track how long it takes a threat actor to actually get into an organization. If we had this conversation 5 years ago, it was roughly on average 10 hours. Today, it's less than 1 hour. The best time is 51 seconds. So they are getting more equipped. They are using technologies like artificial intelligence to speed their processes up. They're very aware of automation and new technologies and techniques, and it's also an ever-growing marketplace where, as Chris mentioned, that they are sharing tools and techniques as well. That would be my biggest concern. The biggest change we've gone to is that sheer number of new actor groups and nation states, but also how successful they are at the speed and automation.
Thanks. So we've seen quite a lot recently about the vulnerability of companies, particularly in the food sector. That's been the recent news. So obviously people are falling foul of this. They may have been trying very hard not to, but it's happened. What do you think about the National Cybersecurity Centre's guidance? Do you think it's good enough? Do you think it's helpful enough? Do you think companies can access it well and understand and apply it? Have you got thoughts around that and perhaps ways it could be improved? Because I think, these are large companies that we're talking about. So if we start to look at the smaller ones where the vulnerability might be, those back doors that get into larger companies, what do you think around the support available?
Well, shall I kick off just quickly? I'm very lucky to sit as the Vice Chair of the Cyber Resilience Committee for techUK, which works with Department for Science, Innovation and Technology to make sure we as a group of industry people can support. And I can say, honestly, I've sat on there for 2 years before my current position. I've never heard negative views about our UK NCSC. I heard only last week from a very senior American who was talking about the differences in the Three Eyes community, especially, which are all very strong, as you'd expect to hear that. But he was, again, very laudatory about the UK NCSC's ability to stay ahead and keep ahead on some of those aspects. So there's some good news there. I think that the bad news, if there's some bad news, is whilst inside the sector with NCSC, there's a lot of awareness and a lot of understanding about what to do. The problem comes mostly at the wider levels of leadership in the UK and in other countries, so it's not just a UK problem, of understanding what is the challenge, what is the risk. As always, time is the biggest problem for everyone, to find that time to study and bring themselves up to speed. But we always urge everybody in leadership positions, financial positions, to understand more about this impact on their business. I don't think there's a person in the UK who's been hit by a cyber attack who's not very focused afterwards. What we're after really is the prevention being better than the cure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the guidance is very, very good. There needs to be a lot more clarity and probably explanation. Where we see a lot of organisations struggle is actually taking that guidance and actually making use of it. I think a great report was the National Audit Office's Cyber Resiliency Report, and one of the areas it highlighted was a lot around not being able to get cybersecurity expertise into departments, and that is the same not just in the public sector but also in the private sector as well. But one area that we have seen beneficial in the private sector is this realisation that they can start utilising shared service providers or managed service providers that can provide like a hybrid approach rather than thinking they have to build everything themselves. But that, and also, yes, a bit more clarity into how to actually get started on their maturity journey when it comes to cybersecurity.
Do you think that there needs to be a much greater focus then at board level as well, and that somebody, ideally you'd have somebody with that expertise, but we know that actually this is an evolving, highly digitalised economy whereby there are less and less people to go around now. I think as we see it's more important. So what might you think could be done to maybe strengthen that oversight at board level?
The UK NCSC has put out very recently some excellent guidance for boards, be they small companies right up to PLCs, and that I would commend to everybody to read. But it's also a culture change. It's not just about having a man or woman sat on the board who is a technical person. Everyone says that's fine. It's really about everyone having a culture change and realising this is just as live a risk as financial crime, fire safety, health and safety, and all the things that we're quite used to in this country because of this great place has made sure that everyone is aware of their responsibilities. So legislation is coming, and there's more legislation tightening with the Cyber Resilience Bill being processed at the moment, and that is with industry. I think we could all urge more interaction with industry where we can, because that allows it to hit the ground as a better act. But I would just say that legislation isn't always the answer. It is definitely about culture change and making sure we urge all those leaders and to pass it down in their organisations to produce those human firewalls, as we call it, get the people just as aware of what to do as the technology.
Great. And then finally then, on this level of risk and this increased risk that we're seeing, and many more companies, becoming a quite public victim, there's reports that some insurers are viewing cyber threats, in the same way they do to terrorism, and therefore they won't insure if there is a breach and if there is obviously a resulting detriment. So what do you think could be done to private-public collaboration, maybe to start to mitigate some of that? Because obviously this is the world we're going into, and if insurers have decided they're not going to insure it, we're in a problem.
Yeah, I think it comes down to more preparedness. And that's the reality. For example, making sure organisations have things like incident response retainers in place, have defined processes. Again, it's good guidelines from the NCSC on how to initiate this, but unsure how many organisations are taking that seriously. And I think it also goes back to what Chris mentioned, having that culture within organisations to realise that they have to be focused on areas like secure by design or secure by default, and make sure they are prepared for these types of incidents.
Thank you.
Okay. Just brief, if I could. It's interesting what you say about sort of the cultures within organisations and sort of bringing about change. Do you think the time has come that we should actually, in the light of recent events, but you think about the British Library that's still basically shut down, and we've seen attacks throughout the public sector, not just business as well, of course. Do you think the time has come, as Estonia did all those years ago, that was post their attack? Do you think it's time we had a national conversation and had a sort of whole of society approach to addressing these threats?
Yeah, I think definitely, if I can just kick that off first, we've done a lot of great things in this country. We've changed understanding about, don't drown when you go to the seaside, wear your seatbelt. There's lots of great campaigns that have happened. And that culture change will come from government guiding and assisting and resourcing that messaging going through, there's no doubt. One of the biggest problems we've got is there's a gap between the fantastic training. Fortinet offer a huge amount of training for free online, and other companies do as well. Everyone has some really good training out there. And trying to get people to click on it and spend time to sit there for 20 or 30 minutes a week and look at it and keep up to date is the challenge. So that normally says to me that there needs to be that leadership or compulsion to do that. It also needs to come back a few years before into the schools as well. If we're going to get the UK really safe and aware, we need to make sure, just as the people on my left are quite rightly saying about their businesses here in the UK, we need to get them up to speed. So the UK STEM Learning Centre, which we're partnering with at the moment, has had a resource cut, I learned the other day. There's lots of things where we're stepping as the sector into headwinds where we'd rather they were tailwinds when it comes to resourcing some of those younger people and also the workforce to get them the free training and tell them, click the button, train.
I think there's a really good collaboration between private and public organisations. It allows us to do what we do best and protect organisations. What we would look to see is, the government using the tools that they have available to them and be able to use, things like law enforcement to go and find these individuals and arrest them. Do more things like takedown of infrastructure utilised by nation states and criminal actors. That can make a big shift and big change into this landscape.
Thomas, Dr. Casey, anything to add to that?
I can only speak from experience, and we have a very, very robust kind of approach to security in Paragraph, partially due to the person that we've hired is very, very experienced in it. But I do think there's one way that you could proliferate this very rapidly, which is through that spin-out startup invested companies, because the people that go through those companies are generally the people that move on to other businesses. So if you want to spread this throughout the industrial sector, if you like, making it part of an investment requirement would be a very good approach. And again, if people see the benefits of it, they're not going to complain about it.
Yeah. Dr. Casey?
I think just from a sort of lower level on a day-to-day basis, I find in a company the cyber essentials approach, it has been extremely helpful in making you think and make you appreciate and review what you do. And I think just from a sort of ground-up approach, that is an extremely beneficial thing. So come on.
Thank you. Well, the Minister is on his feet and there is a vote about to take place. So I will conclude the panel there, but thank you very, very much for such clear and concise evidence today. That has really made our job coming to conclusions a little bit easier. That concludes this panel. That concludes this session.